To celebrate the release of certain new games in a certain series that I'm a pretty big fan of, I thought that I'd do a bit of a special video, and talk about some of my favourite Pokemon in the series. Though there's so many creatures that I feel like I couldn't really make a big list of all of my general favourites. So instead I decided to do my top 5, with one exception, favourite Pokemon from each generation. I like to consider each generation individually anyway. Now, the rules for this was, I did use a website that helped with this, and the link will probably be in the video description and you can see it in these images. On this website, there is the option to restrict the results to only fully evolved Pokemon, and that's what I did. Personally, I really don't care for any unevolved Pokemon unless they're good with Eviolite, so this option was very convenient for me. Also, my favourites here are based on a number of things, mostly based on gameplay, some of them based on my experiences with my competitive teams, others based off of nostalgia for the first things I used in my original playthroughs, and they can be based both on how I felt about that Pokemon in its debut generation, and also changes later on, so both will affect this. But anyway, let's get right to it, starting with Generation 1. Oh boy, I can already see people getting angry at me for this one, but my favourite Pokemon from Generation 1 has always been Charizard, though don't get me wrong, I absolutely hate the fact that it became the patron mon of Gen 1ers, and I have no idea why people started using it in Ubers, but I think it's completely stupid. Anyway, Charizard was my first ever starter, despite the fact that the manual blatantly said first-time players should choose Bulbasaur. I actually really like the fact that Charmander made the first 2 gyms a lot harder than normal, and in fact, going back and replaying things, I don't like how easy Squirtle and Bulbasaur make the early game. When I play games, it's often very satisfying to have most of the challenge contained early on, only to get a big sense of payoff later in the game. Not to mention, I like fast special sweepers. That's going to be a big theme with these favourites. But yeah, and I know Charizard isn't really that fast by today's standards, but back in the day it was pretty alright. Now, I will say that I've always acknowledged Charizard's flaws in competitive play, and yeah, it's always been mediocre to not particularly good. In fact, the real reason why I didn't like Stealth Rock all that much regarding Charizard in Gen 4 was not, oh no, Stealth Rock made Charizard worse, it's the worst thing ever, but, oh no, Stealth Rock made Charizard worse, and it wasn't particularly good to begin with. That's the main problem that I had with Stealth Rock, personally. The fact that it weakened a lot of Pokemon that weren't particularly good in the first place, like lots of bug flyings, and made Pokemon that were already strong, like Gengar and Starmie, even better. As an amendment, I know that Generation 5 and on introduced a lot of stronger Pokemon that really needed Stealth Rock to keep them in check, like Multiscale Dragonite, but back in Gen 4 I still didn't really like it that much. But anyway, I digress. The only real success I ever had with Charizard in competitive prior to the Megas was a Belly Drum set in Gen 3, which of course ripped that set when Stealth Rock came out, but it was kind of fun. Admittedly, having to use Aerial Ace's Flying Stab was a bit awkward. Physical Special Split was one of the best things to happen to Pokemon. I definitely agree about that. Speaking of Charizard and Megas, despite how much I like it, I heavily disagree with it getting 2 Megas. I really don't think that that was a good idea and really shows a lot of blatant Gen 1er pandering. And also the fact that they really pretend that one of them doesn't exist in marketing. Every single spin-off media has always had Mega Charizard X featured the most prominently. In fact, if you only saw spin-off media, you'd be convinced that Mega Y didn't even exist. Which is a shame because I love Mega Y. I like it better than Mega X, mainly because I mostly play VGC and Mega Y is better in doubles while Mega X is better in singles. Speaking of appearances in spin-off games, I will say I personally really hate how they depict Charizard in a lot of spin-off fighting games. Why do they keep making it a slow, bulky brawler? It's supposed to be a fast glass cannon in the main series, but anyway, I digress. Next up on the list is Gengar, and once again you see the thing of fast special sweepers. I really like them. Gengar's pretty simple in what it does, although it does have access to a lot of support moves as well as attacking ones. It's also one of those rare Pokemon that's been pretty consistently good across all generations, although it remains to be seen whether it losing Levitate in Gen 7 is going to impact it very much. Maybe it'll ever fall from grace like Snorlax did, but the future is still uncertain. But anyway, Gengar, not really all that much else to say. I just, fast special sweeper, powerful, pretty good move pool. I've always liked it a lot. Next up on my list is Zapdos. Zapdos is one of those... Okay, I will say right here, I have deliberately excluded major legendaries from this list. I'm only picking from favorites when it comes to the minor legendaries, the ones that are allowed in battle facilities. So out of the 3 Kanto legendary birds, Zapdos is one of the ones that stands out as not having many really glaring flaws. And, I mean, its move pool's a little small, but it has enough to do, quite a few interesting things. Special attacking, but also a few support options. I remember using a Baton Pass Zapdos from XD at one point, and it actually being pretty effective. Another reason Zapdos is on here is, one of my fondest memories from Generation 1 comes when I was trying to catch Zapdos. I put it to sleep with a Hypno, just chucked a ball at it, and first try the ball caught. So, that always stood out to me. At the time, I thought the reason it caught is because I was holding down and B, but I now know that to be a gigantic lie. Yeah, another one of those rumors circulated by children back then that wasn't really true. Next up on the list, we come to a more defensive Pokemon, but this is a Pokemon that did not really make my favorites until at the very least Generation 4. It's one of those that I didn't really care for in its debut generation, and not for a while, but it got some considerable buffs later on that made me like it a lot more. Slowbro, past Generation 4, is a really decent bulky water type, especially with its access to Slack Off. That really made it, that and the addition of Scald as well. But even before Scald, I remember Slowbro was a mainstay on my first competitive team, my first real competitive team back in Generation 4 Pokemon Battle Revolution. It rounded out a fire, water, grass triangle. I like basing a team around one of those, and Calm Mind in addition to Slack Off helped it tank a lot of hits and really act as a good defensive Pokemon for my team, in addition to being able to hit pretty hard. Slowbro also has the benefit of having a very bizarre move pool in some cases. It's a water type that can learn Flamethrower, so that's no idea why, but it works in some situations, though I've always preferred Ice Beam to take out dragons. And last here on my list is Snorlax. Snorlax, again, is a Pokemon that I only really started liking more in later generations, and more once I started discovering the competitive scene. Snorlax was a pretty big, popular Pokemon, no pun intended, in competitive for quite a while until Gen 4 added lots of more powerful fighting types and completely destroyed its usability. It's at least still somewhat decent, but it's not quite as good as it used to be. The thing about Snorlax, though, is it's something that I like in a tank. It's a defensive Pokemon that is also capable of doing decent damage attacking as well. I never really liked Pokemon like Blissey that had uber defenses but could barely do much damage at all, and I really don't like being taunt bait. So Snorlax being able to do decent damage in addition to sponging special hits always appealed to me. Also, there's the fact that Body Slam not only does damage, but it also gives a chance of paralysis, so you've got offense and support in one move. So yeah, in general, Snorlax is the kind of tank that I tend to like. Honourable mention for Generation 1 goes to Alakazam, again being another fast special sweeper, though I didn't like how broken it was back in the Gen 1 games. The reason why Alakazam didn't actually make my top 5 is that it's kind of hard to describe. I've trained several Alakazams, even Magic Guard Life Orb ones, and I've used a lot of them. But just to me personally, I've never really felt as, I don't know, like, it's never really worked for me quite as well as many other Psychic types or special sweepers. Maybe it's the fact that you really need to rely on Focus Blast for coverage, and you know me, I mean, Focus Blast is going to miss most of the time. But every time I've used Alakazam, I don't know, it's just always not felt quite as good to me as it really should. It's just a personal thing, I don't know, I've liked other Pokemon better, just in terms of using them. So because of that, Alakazam just fails to make my top 5. Now we come to Generation 2. Now, I'll just say this to start off with. Generation 2 has my least favourite batch of new Pokemon out of any generation so far. So many of them just had downright terrible stats. So, yeah, and as you can see, none of the starting Pokemon made this list, though honourable mention goes to Feraligatr. Feraligatr did come close to getting number 5 for me, but in the end I decided I liked Kingdra a little bit more. But yeah, it wasn't particularly hard to pick favourites here, because I've got a lot of Pokemon that I know I don't like very much in this generation. But number 1 on this list is Suicune, which as a kid I thought was pronounced Sunicane. Yes, really, I don't know what my reading skills were like back then, but yeah, it was weird. But I digress. Suicune is interesting for me because, once again, it's another one of those minor legendaries that have pretty decent stats and can do quite a lot of things, leaning more towards defensive, though I never really used any of its truly popular competitive defensive sets, like that weird Rest one back in Gen 2. I didn't actually start playing competitive until Gen 3, and even then just only barely. I should at least point that out. So I've never really experienced the ultimate stalling fest that was Generation 2 competitive. So that doesn't really play into my view of Suicune back then. I do know that in Gen 4, I used a Suicune on my Tailwind team. This was back when Suicune was one of the only decent Pokemon that got Tailwind, so I was pretty much forced to use it. Anyway, one major reason why I like Suicune so much is because it was a lot of firsts for the series to me. It was the mascot of Pokemon Crystal version. Now, Crystal to me was the first third version game to have really extensive changes to its base games. Yeah, Yellow had a few things here and there, but all it really was adding the ability to get the starters and replacing a few Rocket Grunt battles with Jesse and James. Crystal changed quite a lot, adding some new areas, new plot elements. Suicune was in fact the first legendary that was actually fully relevant to a game's plotline, and especially, Suicune was the first legendary, well technically the other legendary beast as well, but it was the first legendary to get its own unique battle theme, and oh boy what a great battle theme it was. I still love the Gen 2 legendary beast battle theme, one of my favourites in the series. And I also like that little subplot with Usain that Suicune had throughout the game. Usain was a pretty interesting character, although annoyingly, I actually missed the first battle with him in my first playthrough. I had no idea it even existed until I replayed the game, because I lost my original Crystal cartridge. Funny story, in my house I actually have 3 copies of Pokemon Crystal. My original copy of Crystal, a replacement copy that I got when I lost my original copy of Crystal, but I later found it, and my sister's copy. So, yeah. That's a lot of copies of one game to have. Next up on my list is Porygon 2. Porygon 2 is another one of those tanks that I really like. It doesn't have particularly fantastic offenses, but it makes up for that by having a pretty crazily good move pool, especially getting the Bolt Beam combo. Though the main thing that I like about Porygon 2, in addition to being awesome with Eviolite, but that was added a bit later, is that it's one of those few defensive Pokemon with great defenses that also has access to Recover. So few defensive Pokemon have access to what they call reliable recovery, quote unquote, and Porygon 2 having that is a definite plus, which makes it one of my favourite defensive Pokemon, well, out of Gen 2, but I mean, admittedly that's not saying much, but it is one of my favourite defensive Pokemon in general. Coming in third on my list of Gen 2 favourites is Azumarill, though this one definitely is only later generations. When I first played these games, I absolutely did not care about Marill and Azumarill. They were just kind of there, and not really, I mean, they were just another water type, and one that was kind of meh at that. Then Generation 3 introduced Huge Power, but without the physical special split, it was, I don't know, not really much that you could do with it. Gen 4 not only gave it access to Aqua Jet, but it actually gave it physical stab moves, which made it quite a bit better, but it still wasn't used really that much. Gen 5, not really sure what changed for it in Gen 5, but then Gen 6 happened and Azumarill got completely insane. It's amazing just how much a retyping can do for a Pokemon, but it's suddenly becoming Fairy type, gaining Play Rough, and also the new breeding mechanics, meaning that it could get both Aqua Jet and Belly Drum on the same moveset, suddenly Azumarill became an absolute terror for something so adorable looking. And I've used an Azumarill on one of my, the main team that I took to the Australian Nationals in 2014. In my opinion, the only VGC league in Gen 6 that was actually good. Yeah, you heard me. I always liked it back when it restricted you to only Pokemon caught in the Gen 6 games and no Pokemon Bank and that stuff, but anyway, I completely digress on that. Azumarill served me very, very well, although it's always frustrating when Play Rough misses. Next up on the list is Heracross. The weird thing about Heracross being in my list of Gen 2 favourites is that I went through the vast majority of my Gen 2 life without even knowing Heracross existed. It was such a rare encounter from Shakeable Trees that I just never found one. I didn't even know about Heracross until I looked at the official Pokemon handbook, and at the time I thought it was a new evolution of Pinsir. It was not. Back at the time I didn't really know the Japanese cultural thing about the rivalry between the two species of beetles that Pinsir and Heracross are. So yeah, they're meant to be opposing rivals and not evolutions. The main reason why Heracross is here though is, Heracross, in my opinion, was, well, not so much the outright redemption of Bug as a type, but it was the first sign that Bug could actually be good. Mainly, having a 120 base power Bug type move, even if it was exclusive to itself, really made people think, okay, Bug type can actually be amazing. In addition, Heracross was a pretty powerful Pokemon in its own right, and it actually got a lot of attention Gen 3 competitive-wise. Not sure how much it was used in Gen 2, but it was actually pretty popular for a while. So yeah, Heracross was the first glimmer of hope for the Bug type, a type that was terribly underpowered in Generation 1, and for that reason alone Heracross earns a spot on this list. Next at number 5, like I said, Feraligatr almost edged in here, but Kingdra had a lot of success for me personally in Generation 6 with the Focus Energy Sniper combo, with the major buffs to Focus Energy. When it's combined with a Scope Lens, it gives you pretty much automatic criticals, so that was certainly very fun. I mean, I'm always a fan of making my own luck, because my own luck tends to be relatively terrible. So, yeah, I had a lot of success with the Kingdra in a few Gen 6 competitive teams, even managed to pull a, some would call gimmicky set, where I had it with Draco Meteor and had a Malamar use Topsy-Turvy on it, which actually did get quite a few people. Anyway, I wasn't such a big fan of Kingdra back in its debut generation, but that was mainly because it couldn't really use its Dragon secondary typing to the fullest, because the best Dragon move back then I think was Dragon Breath, which was only about 60 power. Once it got access to Outrage and Draco Meteor, that Dragon typing really started to play into its own. I even used a Kingdra back in Gen 4 competitive before that whole sniper thing really came into effect. So yeah, for that reason Kingdra edges out here. Another honourable mention goes to Tyranitar, or Tyranitar, as I thought it was legitimately pronounced when I was a kid. I actually wish it was, because that sounds so much cooler than Tyranitar, but anyway. Tyranitar was a Pokemon that I only caught for my team really, really late into Crystal, but I liked it so much I decided to make it a permanent fixture in my party, that late into the game. Next we come to Hoenn and Generation 3, and once again a Fire-type starter tops the list. I always have an affinity for Fire-type starters, though I tend to like Water as well. I almost never pick Grass, though in Gen 3 I do like Sceptile quite a bit. In fact, I actually like all of Gen 3 starters a lot. It's one of my favourite sets of starters in their generation. But Blaziken was always the one that just jumped out to me personally. Again, it's mostly the Fire-type starter thing, and being the original firefighting before it got kind of old. Many people back in the day, I remember, didn't like Blaziken due to its 80 base speed, and then later on, who's laughing now? Yeah. Blaziken had the dubious honour of being the first ever starting Pokemon to actually get banned by Smogon because its hidden ability Speed Boost made it ridiculously broken. And it was pretty hilarious, I'll give you that. But even before the ban, I still liked Blaziken quite a lot. It was very powerful, and back in the day, 80 base speed wasn't that bad. Nowadays it kind of is, but back then it was alright, so I always had a lot of fun using Blaziken, though I think a bit too much fun. I pretty much wanted to just solo the Elite Four with it alone, and let's just say I had a lot of trouble with Phoebe. I actually needed to buff the PP of Blaze Kick with lots of PP ups just to even get through her, so that was kind of an issue. Next on this list, we have Shiftry, Walrein, and Gardevoir. Now, I need to give a special amount of attention to this trio, because really, these Pokemon are not on this list individually. It is Gardevoir, Shiftry, Walrein as a trio that make the number 2 spot for me, because these three together have a lot of significance. In my first playthrough of these games, these were 3 Pokemon that were a mainstay of my very first team in the game itself. I found Seedot and I even found Ralts quite early, so both of them joined early on, Walrein joined a little bit later, but for some reason, the 3 of them always had some good synergy together. They've almost built up a lot of character to me, and I got quite attached to the 3. They were also, in fact, the very first team of 3 that I ever brought into the Battle Tower, seriously. I mean, I played Battle Tower a lot back in Gen 2, but I had no idea how it worked back then, so just, my teams were just a random haphazard of stuff. But in Gen 3, when I started taking Battle Tower a little more seriously, though I didn't actually know about EV training at the time, I immediately threw these 3 into the level 50 Battle Tower, because I was like, oh hey, I get to choose 3 Pokemon. These 3 have been working so well together so far, I'm going to include them. Now, back in these days, entering level 50 Battle Tower, you had to be exactly level 50. If you were even level 51, you were forced to compete in the level 100 category. Because of this, I had to really desperately keep these 3 from ever going above level 50. In all of my post-game training sessions and everything, I had to just switch around furiously to make sure that none of them ever went over level 50, which was pretty annoying, but, and, you know, I probably could have just trained them to level 100 anyway, but I always preferred level 50 competitions, so I had to keep them that way. But yeah, these 3 have always had a special place in my heart, because, yeah, I used them as my first ever Battle Tower team. They didn't do too well, but they did alright, and they helped me get through the main storyline. When I first played Pokemon XD, I was very pleased to find out that Seedot, Spheal, and Ralts were all available as Shadow Pokemon very early in the game, within a short time frame of each other, so I recreated my original power trio for my first playthrough of XD. Gardevoir, Shiftry, and Walrein returned, and they served me very, very well throughout the entirety of that game. 5th goes to Zangoose here, but there was actually a lot of competition for this slot. I do like Swampert quite a lot, I like Sceptile as well, and there are a lot of other Hoenn Pokemon that almost edged in here like Salamence and Metagross. The reason why I picked Zangoose above the others is another kind of personal thing. While the Gardevoir, Shiftry, Walrein trio was the first that I actually brought into the Battle Tower, Zangoose was the first Pokemon that I ever brought into the Battle Tower that was actually EV trained with a decent nature. I didn't IV breed back then, but I did breed for natures. I got myself a Jolly Zangoose, and I EV trained it in attack and speed, and picked a pretty decent moveset for it for the time. So, Zangoose was, I guess, one of my first actual competitive, you could say, Pokemon. I remember back in the day, Zangoose was actually somewhat popular competitively. You wouldn't really think that now, but it was actually quite decent for its time. And I did have a lot of success in the Battle Tower using it. So, for personal reasons, Zangoose edges in at number 5 here. And now we come to Generation 4, and here's the exception that I mentioned earlier. Gen 4 introduced my favourite batch of new Pokemon in the series, and because of that, I really could not just pick 5, so I had to go for a top 10 this time. One of the things that I really loved about Gen 4, in addition to its actual, new Pokemon also being very, very good, they added a lot of evolutions of old Pokemon, and I always loved this. Mainly because most of these evolutions of old Pokemon were given to Pokemon that desperately needed more power, that were pretty weak before, and I really liked that. The only exceptions are Rhyperior and Dusknoir. I really don't think that Rhydon and Dusclops needed evolutions, especially since Dusclops is actually a better tank than Dusknoir is, and Rhyperior is essentially just Rhydon with slightly higher stats. Its ability people thought would be amazing back in the day, but nowadays it's like, Solid Rock is alright, but it's not particularly game-breaking. Anyway, because of this, new evolutions of old Pokemon kinda dominate this list, but also a few of the newly introduced Pokemon in Gen 4 as well. It's kinda funny, Diamond and Pearl themselves are easily my least favourite main series games for their actual core main story, but they have my favourite section of new Pokemon, so yeah, kind of weird that. Leading my favourites list for Gen 4 is Staraptor. Staraptor just has an insane amount of cool factor to me. I mean, it's a freaking hawk. I mean, that's pretty awesome. But the main thing that I love about it is, this was the first time, and Swellow was alright, but this was really the first time that the early game bird was actually absolutely, truly amazing. Staraptor is just kind of ridiculous. I know that in competitive it's not all that fantastic, but in game, this thing was amazing back in the day. Especially the fact that it had close combat, a 120 base power fighting move to take out the rock types that normally would beat it, and a 120 power flying stab move in Brave Bird. Staraptor was just severely awesome in every sense of the word, and completely redeemed early game bird Pokemon to me. Really showing that Pokemon you catch early on had the potential to be insanely good. So yeah, I've always loved Staraptor. Speaking of Pokemon that I've always loved, Lucario, if I made an overall favourites list for every generation, would rank very, very high there, but it's not for the reasons that most people like Lucario. Personally, I like Lucario due to the sheer unpredictability of its move pool. Have you seen the move pool on this thing? Seriously, I would recommend just reading over the full move pool that Lucario gets sometime. It's absolutely absurd. I've always thought to myself that I could make a team of 6 Lucarios, and I could give all of them a different moveset, and all of them a unique role to play on the team. That is how varied and versatile Lucario's move pool is. And unlike some Pokemon, cough, Machamp, getting things like Flamethrower and Thunderbolt and Ice Beam and stuff, cough, Lucario actually has the stats to use these. It also has the thing like, okay, to quote Smogon, Lucario has access to both Swords Dance and Nasty Plot, and also access to both physical and special priority. That is pretty insane. In fact, the sheer unpredictability of its move pool got to the point where I think Mega Lucario was banned in Smogon competitive, mainly due to just how unpredictable it was, which made it nearly impossible to counter, but personally, I've always loved Lucario for its sheer unpredictability and just how much you can surprise opponents with it. I mean, there are quite a few standardized sets for it to be sure, but really, all you need to do is vary one move on it and you can really take people by surprise, and Lucario has the stats to really do that. I just love the sheer amount of customization that Lucario has, and it's always been one of my favorites for that very reason. Coming in at number 3 is Empoleon. Empoleon was my starter of choice back in Generation 4, and it's another one of those that I've always liked. Main thing that appeals to me about it is just its typing, which gives it an absolutely absurd amount of resistances. Back in the day, there were very few things that could hit Empoleon for decent damage, and it was pretty safe to switch in on a lot of things. The weird thing was, I never in my life expected Empoleon to actually be OU at some point in the competitive scene. It actually was, and Agility's sub-Pataya moveset ended up becoming really, really popular, and yeah, surprisingly, Empoleon ended up being OU, which, again, completely baffled me, because as much as I liked it, I never expected it to be that good. And coming in at number 4 is Infernape. Infernape's another one of those starters that I really like, and it was a firefighting that felt very distinct from Blaziken, having much more speed and a bit more of a focus on mix sweeping somewhat, but also being a pretty powerful physical attacker as well. Infernape was on one of my first competitive teams ever that I took online on Pokemon Battle Revolution, and it's one of those starters that's always been pretty good in competitive, which is quite rare, so that's another thing that I've liked about Infernape. Gen 4 starters in general are some of my favourite starters in the series, though Torterra's probably a little lower on my list, but it's still pretty decent. All 3 of them are actually pretty amazing in-game, so I did like that. Next on the list is Roserade, which is another Pokemon that was on my first ever competitive team in Gen 4, so yeah, it's got a bit of nostalgia there. But Roserade was one of the first grass types that I really liked, mainly because it had a decent, by the standards of its time, speed combined with massive special attack, and access to a lot of powerful moves like Leaf Storm and the now special Sludge Bomb. It also had a great support move pool with things like Toxic Spikes and Sleep Powder, so Roserade was a very fun Pokemon to use. Personally, I always liked the Choice Scarf moveset. A Choice Scarf one with Sleep Powder, I never thought that having Choice Scarf on a non-attacking move would be so useful, but leading with that and putting something to sleep right off the bat, then switching out, proved to be quite useful to me in a lot of battles. Next is Bronzong, another good defensive Pokemon with a great defensive typing. Really not much else to say. I used Bronzong on, well, I actually used it pretty unconventionally. Rather than Trick Room or other things that it can do, I actually used Bronzong on a Rain team. Because yes, it did have access to Rain Dance, which is actually kind of a cool nod to the mythology it's inspired by, and it helps cover its fire weakness, so Bronzong was like kind of an unconventional Pokemon to be using on a team like that, but I thought, yeah, it's something that people wouldn't be expecting on a Rain team. So I went with it, and it served me very, very well. Also, this was back before Explosion got nerfed, so it's setting up Rain, light screens with the light clay, and then blowing itself up always served to be a good lead in my battles. Next, Mismagius, another evolution of an old Pokemon. One that was, again, pretty mediocre, but Mismagius, the main reason why I like Mismagius is its stats immediately leapt out to me. They were nice and even, but having high stats in special attack, special defense, and speed, it gave me a real Fire Emblem Mage vibe, which I really liked from it. And it had a pretty decent move pool too. Mismagius was never really fantastic competitively, but it was one that I always liked because, again, it really helped with my Fire Emblem. With me being a Fire Emblem fan, it really felt like the first Pokemon that truly felt like a mage to me. Next, Mamoswine. I don't think I ever truly used a Mamoswine competitively in Gen 4, but it was another example of a Pokemon that took something that was pretty mediocre before and actually made it very good. Mamoswine's actually been pretty consistently used competitively ever since then, which is a pretty amazing feat considering that Piloswine was pretty bad for the most part, so that's the main reason Mamoswine makes this list, the sheer amount of improvement that it got. Next after Mamoswine is Gliscor, or Gliscor. I've always said Gliscor, but anyway. This was even before Poison Heal, but Gliscor was another example of taking a mediocre Pokemon and making it actually very good and commonly used competitively. Gliscor proved to be a very effective defensive Pokemon, and that only increased when it got Poison Heal, which was always insanely frustrating to fight, but again, another reason why I like it is it's another one of those most improved things. After that, Yanmega. Now, Yanmega here I'm more like for, again, cool factor, but the fact of a gigantic dragonfly that's a massively powerful, well, not massively powerful, but pretty powerful special attacker, always definitely appealed to me. I know it gets totally destroyed by Stealth Rock, but it was a pretty cool Pokemon, and I liked that it also had access to Speed Boost, and Detect, and also being able to hit things with Hypnosis, and access to a few unconventional move options as well, like Giga Drain, helping it destroy rock types that would otherwise completely wreck it. Next is Garchomp. Now, Garchomp is this low on my list simply because of how overpowered it became in competitive. I didn't really like how over-centralizing it got, and because of that, I'm not as big a fan of it, but I can't deny just how good Garchomp was. It was one of the first times that a non-legendary ever got officially banned by Smogon, and it was a really big deal back in the day. In fact, though, I think it was more due to how annoying it got with Sandvale, but regardless of that, Garchomp was always pretty amazing, and it's funny, because back then, people thought, when the games first came out, they actually said, huh, Garchomp's never going to be really successful. And look how wrong they were. And next on my list is also proof positive why you should never ever ever trust early predictions about the competitive scene, Electivire. Back in the day, everybody thought Electivire was going to be the big thing from Gen 4, and they were saying things like, it's been hyped for a reason, expect to see it everywhere. Oh, how wrong they were once again. But I still kind of like Electivire. Mainly in Gen 4, it kind of shot down in usefulness back in Gen 5. But in Gen 4, I had an Electivire that had a special place in my heart. I found that Zaprong, the Elekid you get in a trade from Pokemon XD, had a jolly nature and pretty decent IVs, and a pretty perfect moveset for being an Electivire, so I imported it into my Gen 4 games, and used it as an Electivire in my first competitive team back then. So, yeah. By the way, my first team back then was Roserade, Infernape, Slowbro, Electivire, Snorlax, Azelf. It was pretty successful for me back then, actually. In fact, you can see some of my early battles with it on this channel, though be warned, a lot of them were recorded with a camcorder. So, yeah, crappy quality alert. Next, we come to Gen 5, my favourite generation overall. There are a lot of Pokemon that could make this list. I have a lot of honourable mentions here, but in the end I felt that it didn't quite justify making this one a top 10. I still had 5 that I definitely liked more than the others. You might also notice here that none of the starters are on this list. Gen 5 has my least favourite set of starters by far of any generation. It's a shame because Samurott looks really cool and has a cool concept, but man, those stats were not great. And yeah, all of them just, I mean, Superior was alright, but the others were just, yeah. Heard people have had some success with Emboar, but I don't really like it personally. So anyway, my top choice here is Chandelure. Chandelure, the thing that immediately stuck out to me was that 140 base special attack. Chandelure really showed the stat power creep of Gen 5, something that I really did like, and just seeing that special attack stat, it was just like, wow, can you really have a special attack stat that high on a non-legendary? Its other stats aren't really all that great to compensate, but Chandelure is still pretty brutally powerful if you set it up right. I've used one on a Tailwind team, I've used it in Trick Room, I've used one as more of a supporter, I've trained up several Chandelures in my day. Next on the list is Galvantula. Galvantula is one of the few Pokemon that's kind of on this list for looks. It's kind of weird, but Galvantula is one of the few Pokemon that I actually would consider cute. It's weird, and yeah, it's a spider, but I don't know why, but I just really like Galvantula. It's one of those Pokemon that I kind of almost wish was real. It's strange, me being Australian, the country that has some of the deadliest spiders in the world, but I just really like Galvantula personally. But in battle, it's actually no slouch. While its special attack is pretty average, it does have Compound Eyes Thunder to make up for that a bit, and later on it got access to Sticky Web, which is a pretty useful move. I've never made a full Sticky Web team, but Galvantula is one of my favourite uses of Sticky Web overall. Coming in at number 3 is Conk Elder. Conk Elder is very similar to Chandelure. I love that it has a massive attack stat. Conk Elder overall I've always liked much more than Machamp. It's sacrificing special defense for a lot more bulk on the HP side and a lot more physical power, and a lot less speed, making it perfect for Trick Room, but it can do quite a wide variety of things. It can tank, it can use Life Orb boosted sheer force attacks, it can use Wide Guard to protect its teammates in double battles. Conk Elder's got quite a bit it can do. It can even use Mach Punch to get around its low speed. And it's also one of those Pokemon where a lot of its abilities are all equally very good. And whenever I train one, I actually have a legitimately hard time considering which ability to go for. They all have their advantages. Sheer Force is great for Life Orb, but also for a lot of moves that it has access to that benefit from it. But Iron Fist powers up Mach Punch and a lot of other moves that it has. Really? And then there's also Guts, which you can hold something like a Flame Orb and get a massive boost to attack power, so all 3 of them are really great abilities. It's one of the rare Pokemon that has that distinction. Next is Volcarona. Personally, to me, Fire Bug is an insanely cool typing, and it's one I never expected them to do, but to actually do it and on a Pokemon so powerful was always really amazing. When I first read the description of Quiver Dance, I was like, wait a minute, that's actually a thing that exists? Really? Boosting special attack, special defense, and speed, so you've got like a special Dragon Dance plus Calm Mind? In practice, it's held in back a little bit by Stealth Rock and a few other things, but Volcarona's always been a very powerful Pokemon, and one that I've always really loved using. It's just pretty great, and again, a bug type that is on fire, that it's just really cool to me. And lastly, we have Cavalier, yet another bug type. You may notice that there are 3 bug types out of my top 5. While Heracross I felt was the glimmer of hope for the bug type, Gen 5 is when bug type was truly redeemed as the type and became a force to be reckoned with for me, with a lot of bug types being very, very good, and even the 2 early game common bug types actually were not bad. Leavanny is decent, and Scolipede is fantastic as a speed boost baton passer. So, just props to Game Freak for making bugs so good in Generation 5. It's just really insane just how powerful it became. Anyway, Cavalier is one that not a lot of people like, but again, as you can probably tell from some of my Fire Emblem videos, I have always liked Knights in armor. I like Armor Knights in Fire Emblem, they're one of my favorite classes, and because of that, Cavalier immediately appealed to me. But the real reason Cavalier is on this list is because I had very, very good success using one on a Trick Room team in Generation 5 competitive. That thing just blasted through the competition, just annihilating stuff with Mega Horn. I always loved it in my Trick Room team, so that's why it earns a spot on this list. Now, I like a lot of Gen 5 Pokemon, so there's a lot of honorable mentions here. Honorable mentions go to Darmanitan, to Hydreigon, Haxorus, and Scrafty. So yeah, like I said, a lot of Pokemon in this generation that I really liked. Heck, even Garbodor gets an honorable mention when Maryland used one to ridiculously insane effect in one of his Wedlock challenges. Completely changed a lot of people's opinion on that Pokemon. I'd highly recommend checking it out. And now we get to Generation 6, which is a pretty big mixed bag for me when it comes to Pokemon. I really love a lot of Pokemon in it, but they just introduce so few new ones. One of my biggest gripes with Generation 6, and one of the reasons why it's my second least favourite generation in the series, is that they just, I don't know, it just was annoying, especially after Generation 5 tried to be so fresh and innovative. But I digress. Going to this list, number 1 is Chestnut. Now, this is kind of weird, because when I first played, and in fact when I first saw the starters, I never thought that Chespin would be my first choice. Grass has never really appealed to me as a starter type. Never have I picked Grass as my primary starter in any generation until 6, and even in Generation 6, I originally had Froakie as my primary starter, and I went with that in my first playthrough. So yeah, Chespin was reduced to being my secondary file starter. But when I actually started using Chestnut, I found that I liked it much more than I expected it to. And once again, it plays into my love of Medieval Knights. Chestnut is, again, pretty similar to a Fire Emblem Armor Knight, but I actually got surprising success with Chestnut in competitive teams, both in single and double battles. In my first team that I used online, Chestnut actually had quite a bit of success. I was using a bulk up set with Synthesis, I believe, and it proved to be fairly effective. Then in double battles, I had an even more effective Chestnut that surprised a ton of people when they were like, oh look, it's 4 times weak to flying, I send my Talonflame, and then I'm like, aha, ha 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 ha, Quick Guard. Yeah, by the way, Chestnut can learn that, didn't see that coming, did you? I actually trolled a lot of Talonflames like that, and Quick Guard was good enough to stall them until my Garchomp could Rock Slide the Talonflame away, and leave Chestnut with free reign to do some pretty decent damage. I really liked the Chestnut that I used on that team, which I actually took to Nationals and did not too bad with. Next up on the list is Greninja, and I admit Greninja's in a similar boat to Charizard for me, in that how insanely overpopular it's got has made me like it a little bit less, but I still quite like it. It's yet another fast sweeper, and I always like those, and it has the unique bonus of getting stab on everything, so that's also pretty cool, though admittedly it got a little bit too good in Oras when they introduced a few move tutors that made it even more powerful. But anyway, Chestnut, you know, has always actually been my favorite starter in this generation, but I still really like Greninja. Greninja comes very, very close. Again, its overhype kind of makes it sure that it's not number 1 in my heart. Speaking of overhype, the next Pokemon on my list is Talonflame, which is probably going to be annoying for some people who are sick of seeing it over and over again. I am fairly glad that Generation 7 has nerfed Gale Wings, but yeah, Talonflame's on this list for similar reasons to Staraptor. It's one of those early game flying types that's actually cool, and also very, very good. though not as much in-game because no access to Gale Wings unless you're lucky with Wonder Trade. But also the fact that the early game bird evolves into a fire type, which not only did I find very cool, but it's the first time that one of the early game flying types has actually become something other than a normal flying, which, yeah, was also pretty cool. So I like that, definitely a unique touch there, and Talonflame's served me fairly well on a few teams. I've again used it both in singles and in doubles. I've mostly liked using more supportive Talonflames that use priority Tailwind. Next up is Delphox. You may notice that all 3 starting Pokemon are in my top 5 list for this generation. Generation 6 was the first generation where I loved all 3 starters, though Delphox a little bit less than the other 2 because, as you can see, it's lower on this list. Main reason there is, I really like Delphox's stats, especially its kind of interesting speed tier. It outspeeds quite a few common things. Unfortunately, it has a pretty bad move pool. If only its move pool was a bit better, then it could have actually been something pretty good, but I've still had a fair bit of success with Delphox. I've used a substitute Carmine Salakberry set in my first X and Y competitive team, and it did reasonably well for itself when it was fighting anything that wasn't unaware Clefables. Yeah, they became my nemesis back then. Anyway, Delphox also, I like the mage aesthetic that it has. In fact, another reason why I really liked the 3 starters from Generation 6 is they fit into classic RPG archetypes of like the knight, the thief, and the mage, which I felt was pretty cool, though again, Delphox deserved a better move pool, more befitting of a mage. Next is Agar Slash. So yeah, yet another Pokemon that became a little bit too good and ended up getting banned by Smogon. Agar Slash is, in addition to, again, fueling my love of medieval stuff, it's also a Ghost-type possessed sword, which has a lot of cool factor for me, but the main reason why I like Agar Slash so much is it has a playstyle that's extremely unique and was never done in Pokemon before. I mean, there were Pokemon that could switch forms mid-battle before, but previously they were just gimmicks. But with Agar Slash really had its own unique strategy and added a huge amount of elements to the battle just by being there, for both you and your opponent. Agar Slash had that thing of using King Shield or other certain defensive moves to swap between a more defensive form and an attacking form. The defensive form was always annoying to take down, and could use King Shield to lower your attack sharply if you use physical contact moves. However, King Shield was not effective against status moves, which means you could hit them with Will-O-Wisp. In addition, it also had its sword form, which it went into when it attacked. It was extremely powerful from both the physical and special sides of the spectrum, but if it got caught in this form and took a hit, it was as good as gone. I liked that element that Agar Slash had, the mind games you could play with it, all the unique strategies that revolved around it. It really did something that no Pokemon had ever done before, and I really enjoyed the aspect that it brought to battles. And of course, it turned out to be a bit too much, and thus most people found it too powerful. But anyway, so there you have it, my favourite Pokemon from every generation up to 7. My favourite Pokemon from Generation 7? Well, only time will tell. I'll have to use more of them in battle before I truly decide. But feel free to leave in the comments section what are your favourite Pokemon from each generation. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's given you more of an insight into the kind of Pokemon that I like and my history with the series. And I'll see you in the next thing I upload. So, see you then.